Hi, I'm Jason Graves. I'm the music composer for Evolve.
So let's start by talking about the challenges of bringing music to this very different type of shooter when you have the monster versus four-player video game gameplay dynamic.
That was the most interesting aspect to me as a composer because you can play from two very different sides. And from the beginning, Turtle Rock wanted the music to reflect which side you were playing on, which essentially means you're talking about two completely different scores. And I use scores in very general terms because the music was very pieced together to make kind of an interactive whole. So lots and lots and lots of little short pieces of music that are being triggered on a fairly regular basis that I think when you're playing the game, it kind of sounds like the music's just evolving, I know, but it's a great word. So the music's evolving and following you as you're playing, but it's these little short, maybe 15, 20-second pieces of music that get triggered directly related to gameplay, and there's literally hundreds of these little variations of music. So it really does evolve with the gameplay. It works really well.
Did you look at different creatures because there are a lot of different ones, and do they have unique sounds that people will hear as they play through from that perspective?
There was basically a general monster perspective and then a hunter perspective. We couldn't get too granular with the kinds of monsters because there just wasn't enough minutes of music and there wasn't enough time to implement it.
But what are the differences when people play on both sides? Like, what did you draw from being this big hulking creature versus this team-based experts that are armed to the hilt?
A lot of it really comes down, for me, whenever I'm doing music for games, as to what is the music enabling the player to feel. So if you're a monster, and we're talking about music that enables you, not music that terrifies you or makes you run away. This is a shooter, and it might be a little suspenseful, but we want you to feel like you're in control and like you know what you're doing. You want to feel, really cool while you're playing it. So as a monster, it was more about kind of guttural, I don't want to use the word monstery sounds, but it really is. It's like, what is that sound? I don't quite recognize it, but it sounds really cool. It's got a lot of power and a lot of weight to it, and there's this slow kind of churning energy to the tracks that it's almost like the interior of the monster that's, the blood's pumping and the muscles are moving and the ground's crunching as you're walking because they're big. We're talking about big monsters. So I wanted the music to lend a sense of scale and weight to the player as they were playing, because you don't even really see much of yourself as a monster. So that's kind of what I thought the music should do, is musically portray the monster. Same idea with the hunters. They're people, but they're all armed to the hilt, they're very coordinated, they're very technical, and they're also really experienced. So there's a lot more precision involved with the hunter music, and some electronics as well that sound like electronics. There's not that kind of, what is that sound? I don't know, but it makes me feel really cool. Everything's very specific. There's some, snare drums in there occasionally, some electric guitars, things that are familiar, and things that are grounded and steady, and also faster because you're smaller.
How have past games like the very horrific Dead Space and the more action-oriented but still thrilling Tomb Raider influenced what you've done with Evolve?
Those are two excellent games to bring up because out of all the games that I've done, those are probably the two that have informed future work for me in terms of creativity. Dead Space, I learned a lot about texture and experimental sounds with a giant orchestra. With Tomb Raider, I wanted to do something similar with texture and experimental sounds, except it was just me, literally in this studio. So it's the same idea, but on a much smaller scale. And I wanted it to have that intimate kind of sound. But what I learned from Tomb Raider was recording myself here and how different instruments sound and how sometimes something that maybe doesn't make a very interesting sound on its own sounds incredible once you put a really sensitive mic in front of it. So it was an interesting dichotomy with Evolve because I was using textures like Dead Space. It needed to be scary and a little dark, kind of like some of the Dead Space more tame tracks were. But then I also was doing it all here. We'd have no orchestra sounds in Evolve, not even synthesized violins. It's all mostly live stuff from me playing, which is what I learned on 2.5 years for Tomb Raider, was kind of how to make the studio work for me, how to use it as a tool, and how to experiment with sounds.
Can you kind of walk us through the process? I mean, you've got this nice big HD TV. Do you have gameplay footage that you're watching or playing to match up? Just talk a little about how you bring a soundtrack to life for a video game.
The most important thing I could get from a developer is probably gameplay movies. Now, I've got dev kits for all the new consoles so I can play through, but I'm not the best player, and honestly, even if I'm completely immortal and I have unlimited everything, I get distracted playing instead of watching and listening. So gameplay movies for me are perfect because I can put them up on the screen and literally run them in real time with the music tracks. It enables me to see the game and even hear the sound effects, even if they're normally just temp, and play the music against it, and I can stop and the movie stops. I can replay scenarios and tweak the music a little bit. When you're playing the game, it's live and you're kind of stuck. So it's the ultimate cheat, I guess. But I love having the movies up here. That's how I draw a lot of my inspiration. That and all the concept art and story backgrounds and everything the developer usually sends.
And being based here in Raleigh, talk a little about the game industry and how it really does allow people to connect from anywhere today to build a game from multiple different locations.
You know, the funny thing is, so many people still assume that I live in Los Angeles. I get Facebook messages and emails and things from people that haven't met me before. Just moved to LA, would love to get some coffee. I'm like, well, that sounds great, but it's going to be a bit of a flight, come all the way to North Carolina for a cup of coffee. Game developers especially are used to outsourcing all their contractors to different parts of the world. They've got textures in Thailand and sound design, sometimes done locally, sometimes done on a completely different place, maybe in Los Angeles, maybe in New York. And music is definitely the same way. The only downside to being a composer is if you're doing textures in Thailand, it's a team of 30 people. If you're doing music, it's just one. So if you're the second choice for music, basically means you don't get the gig, which is tough because you're competing on a world market. There's other composers in LA and New York and London that you're directly competing against, which makes for a tight network of friends, though.
And when you do work with an orchestra, how do you choose? Are you working locally with an orchestra, or do you go to other locations and use other orchestras when you do use them for games?
Well, the Dead Space series is actually a great example. The first game, I think the first recording was in 2006. We did that in Seattle. And then we had another session for that one. We did it at Skywalker Sound. I kind of fell in love with Skywalker. So we did the rest of the first game and the entire second game at Skywalker. Then EA wanted to up the ante a little bit, and there were some issues with contracts and things in the States, so we ended up going to Abbey Road for the third Dead Space, which is also where I recorded in London for Command & Conquer. So it's really all over the map. There's a whole Eastern European thing of 5 or 6 different studios that have willing and able musicians in studios and they're ready to go. But when it comes down to it, you're talking about big budgets and big games. Your two choices are Los Angeles and London. That's kind of what's seen as the best of the best.